Chasca has a lot of team options. This can make playing her really confusing, so in this video we're gonna go over some of the best teams to play her in. Starting off with the first team, it's a team I found really good success with, and I would argue is her best team. This team has many positives, but the main one is that this team makes use of all the new mechanics and benefits the new meta brings, creating huge buffs and huge damage. First, the team starts off with Furina, and as I mentioned in my build guide, she's basically Chasca's best teammate. As a quick refresher, Chasca is going to fire off bullets of all kinds of elements, and these elements are going to be reflective of her teammates. Thus, it's really good to have a damage bonus of the elements you'll be firing, which is exactly what Furina does. Of course, in order to build Furina stacks, you're gonna need a healer. Shilonen may pop into mind, but unfortunately, she does bring a few problems. See, Chasca wants to have swirlable elements in her team. This requirement plays directly into one of Chasca's big damage increasing talents, where if you have these swirlable elements, she deals much higher damage. Since Shilonen is Geo, she's not going to play into this and thus cause Chasca to deal lower damage. Nevertheless, I did try the team out, and surprisingly it still did perform very well, and in some cases even better than the full swirlable team I'll mention next. This is no doubt thanks to Shilonen's big resistance shred and her ability to build Furina stacks very well, so while she may not be a flawless healer, as long as she's with Furina, her buffs negate Chasca's loss in damage, so you can still very much use her. Now, if you don't have Shilonen or you want to actually maximize Chasca's talent, the next best healer is going to be Bennett. While he won't build the max amount of Furina stacks, he can still build a good amount of them if he's in a healer build, which I definitely recommend to do so. Plus, in exchange for not maximizing Furina's damage buff, he'll still grant Chasca huge amounts of attack, so he again remains as a very good option as usual. This leads us to the final spot of the team, which is for Ororon. Ororon's main use in the team is his ability to use Force Cinder City, giving the team a 40% Hydro and Electro damage buff, which again, since Chasca will be firing these bullets, is huge. But beyond this set, he's also just a very good battery when he uses the Favonius bow, which for this team is actually very needed since everyone in the team is going to be of different elements, so they will struggle with energy quite a bit. All of these things make Ororon a much needed support that's honestly the backbone of this team. Now, for different versions of this team, first I want to mention the free-to-play version of this team. Thankfully, Benny and Ororon are 4-stars, so even if you are free to play and try to use this team, much of the team's strength is still retained. Really, the only problem is Furina, and for her case, basically slot in anyone you like. Mona is a good replacement and will continue the over-vape nature of this team. Other than her, you can play any sub-DPS like Fischl or Xiangling. You can also play other supports if you like, and a prominent support I haven't mentioned is Sara. She'll produce an attack buff for Chasca, and best of all, if she C6, she should increase the crit damage of Chasca's electric bullet, with which both her and Ororon being in the team will be very prevalent. Now let's go over some reaction-based teams, and honestly there are so many reaction teams Chasca can be played in, so be sure to let me know what teams you're playing her in. But anyways, one that's really impressed me is this Chasca freeze team. See, in certain scenarios it can be a bit of a headache to play Chasca, since some enemies are constantly moving, they go underground, and if you don't actually have a sight on them, Chasca just stops loading bullets in general. Playing freeze solves this completely. In this team, it's no headache at all to get off shots, and in fact it's very easy to do so. Recall just how much this enemy type was moving in the last showcase, and now he's barely moving since he's frozen, and he's very easy to shoot at. So this team is very comfy, it makes fights very easy, and best of all, the damage output of this team is still very nice. You may think that because this team is freeze and therefore there's no reaction damage, this team will deal low damage, but this is not the case. In truth, this team deals very close damage to that of the first team, and this is because this team plays some really unique buffs and buffers that also make it fun to play. The prime of these buffers is Shenhe. Shenhe doesn't get much attention nowadays, but thankfully in this team, aside from Furina, she's basically the #1 support in this team. This is because she will give all kinds of really useful buffs. For instance, she'll increase ice damage dealt thanks to her quills and passives, she'll reduce the enemy's ice resistances, in addition to increasing charge attacks, skill, and burst damage. All of these buffs cater perfectly to Chasca and make Shenhe a remarkably good support for her. Next to her, we've got Furina, and then Charlotte to maximize Furina's buffs. As with everyone else's build, Charlotte is built as you would build her normally, but I found the most success with her when she's using 4 Cinder City. Now the thing about this set is that Charlotte isn't going to be able to maximize this set because she doesn't have a Night Soul bar, so she's not going to be able to produce the 40% damage bonus as Ororon may, but nonetheless she can provide a 12% damage bonus, which, although it's not a 40%, is still actually very nice. And again, considering that Chasca will fire both of these elements, that being Hydro and Cryo, it's still very nice to have. Furthermore, you've got the Cryo Resonance going on, which will increase Chasca's crit rate. So all in all, this team is just really good. It gives you everything you'd want and then some. For replacements, you've got a lot of really good options. For Charlotte's case, you can replace her with Kokumi, or if you want to keep the Cryo Resonance going, you can use Chi-Chi or Mika. Concerning Shenhe, you could use Ganyu in a burst build, which for those of you that don't know is very viable. Ganyu also becomes a bit of a support, as when her burst is active, the active character gains a 20% cryo damage bonus. Now you can also replace Shenhe with Ayaka. Though Ayaka won't provide any sort of buffs to her teams, her high burst damage will make up for this, but do be careful when using it, as if you don't use it right and say you miss it, it does lead to a huge damage loss. Finally, there's Layla, who on top of giving a shield can also buff charge attack damage with her C4, and she can also grant attack with the right sets. The next team I have for you is a vape team. Now this team is similar to the first, but it does have its own strengths and key things to consider while playing it, so it does deserve its own section. Beyond being competitive for the best team, a very nice thing about it is that you have multiple sources of damage. It's not just Chasca dealing the main chunk of damage and that everything relies on her. Instead, you're going to be triggering vape as you play her, and this leads to both her damage and your vape damage being high. And in fact, you'll also notice in my gameplay some vapes ranging from 50k to 70k. Really, the only downside to this team is that you won't always be triggering vape with Chungling. Given that Chasca is going to be constantly firing both Hydro and Pyro bullets, not to mention that her bullets will be sort of random, the order of the reactions will be mixed up. So your damage isn't always going to be high, and sometimes Furina is actually going to be the one that will be doing the vaping. But even if this does happen, it's not a huge deal, just because Furina herself will deal high off-field damage. Speaking of Chungling, she is huge in this team, but before we get into why, be sure to be close enough to enemies when her Pyronado is active, because it is actually possible to be too far and not hit him with it. Anyhow, so she is really good because on top of dealing high passive damage, Chungling will also reduce the enemy's pyro resistance as well as buff Chasca's pyro damage. Chungling can also buff Chasca's attack thanks to the chili that Guoba leaves after. Now anyways, let's move on to the alternative units you can use. For Furina, you can replace her with any Hydro off-field damage dealer, and some great options I didn't mention is Ayato when purely built for his burst. You can also make use of Yolan and Xingqiu, but the downside with them is that their burst won't be active when Chasca is using her skill. Still though, because of their presence, Chasca will be firing off Hydro bullets, so it's not all bad if you use them. Well everyone, this is my Chasca team guide. I hope you guys enjoyed and used the teams I've mentioned, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and let me know what teams you'll be using with her. Thank you all for watching, and take care.